Hello, everybody. This is Patrick Bergin speaking from Washington, D.C. Thank you for making the time to join me today for this webinar. These live updates are an exclusive benefit that AWF is providing to some of our top supporters, and we appreciate your participation. As the year 2012 is coming to a close, I just want to thank you for your generous support of our conservation work this year, and we hope that AWF continues to be at the top of your year-end giving list. Today we're going to discuss an important and timely concern in African conservation, and that's the escalating illegal wildlife trade. A number of you have been on these calls before, but throughout the seminar I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes. Throughout the webinar, please use the dialog box on your screen if you'd like to submit a question. And at the end of my presentation I'll answer as many of those questions as I can. And otherwise another AWF staff person will get back to you sometime in the next few days with a reply to your question. Now, as you may recall, in my first live update, which was last spring, I focused specifically on the poaching crisis which is plaguing Africa's rhinos. And this continues to be a top concern and focus for AWF. We're working with other conservation groups and local partners and continuing to try to tackle this problem from a variety of angles. Today, however, I want to talk about the root cause that is behind this horrific poaching, and which is driving people to kill animals, and that, of course, is the illegal wildlife trade. The illegal wildlife trade is really a worldwide criminal industry. It's not just a conservation issue, but it's actually a security issue that is threatening the stability of countries and regions. Though estimates are difficult to come by due to the secretive nature of this business, the illegal trade is thought to generate close to $20 billion annually. In terms of illicit activities, this ranks among the most lucrative, along with human trafficking, drug smuggling, and arms dealing. And this figure that I've given you doesn't even include illegal fishing and the illegal timber market, which is estimated to generate in excess of $23 billion annually. The illegal wildlife trade is involving many players at different levels, from local poachers to terror groups to organized criminal syndicates, kingpins, and cartels. Those of us in the conservation community have watched in dismay as the illegal trade and poaching have become increasingly militarized and sophisticated. This global criminal activity crosses almost every time zone and, of course, is linked with a dramatic increase in poaching and degradation of wildlife on the ground in Africa, in the national parks and game reserves, and in community areas. Let's look again at rhino poaching. Rhino poaching has been increasing rapidly since 2007. Last year, 448 rhinos were killed in the Republic of South Africa. Over 588 rhinos have been killed there this year. At this current rate, we expect that 620 rhinos will be lost by the end of 2012. This poaching is being fueled by demand for rhino horn in Asia and an underground trade that enables those horns to get from Africa to Asian markets. But now the threat is, of course, not limited to rhinos. Elephant poaching has increased exponentially in the last several years, driven by demand for their ivory. 2011 was the worst year for elephants since 1989, when records were first kept. 17 large seizures of ivory were recently made, all in transit to China. This equates to, these ivory shipments that have been seized equate to approximately 4,000 dead elephants. However, we know that the number of elephants represented based on these ivory seizures doesn't come close to the number actually being poached in the field. According to some estimates, between 25,000 and 35,000 elephants were slaughtered last year. The example of Zakuma National Park in Chad is a poignant one. The elephant population in Zakuma represented one of West Africa's largest remaining savanna elephant populations. In 2005, the population was estimated at nearly 4,000 elephants. But by 2008, two sample counts showed no more than 1,000 elephants left in this 1,200 square kilometer refuge. A recent count indicates that there are now only 400 to 500 elephants left in the park, and that means we have only 10% of the elephants that existed only 6 years ago. Our closest relatives, the great apes, are also under threat from the illegal trade. In 2011, the Central African country of Gabon saw the largest seizure of great ape body parts in Africa. Only 9% of the world's forests where most great apes live remain intact. However, together with the demand for bushmeat and for these other products, let's not forget the illegal pet trade, which has also encouraged poachers and illegal traders to infiltrate and plunder wildlife areas. This is a human story as well. People on the front lines of wildlife protection are also in harm's way. It is estimated that one ranger is killed every week to protect the world's wildlife. Dozens of rangers are killed in Africa each year, and we're aware of 15 individuals who have been killed while serving our partner, the Kenya Wildlife Service, alone. Looking at countries, it is important to note not only the source countries and the final destination countries, but that the trade also involves transit countries, places that are either unable or unwilling to halt the flow of illegal wildlife and wildlife parts through their borders. Illustrated in this map are some of the popular commercial flights which have increasingly become important routes for wildlife trade. Many of these routes didn't even exist 10 years ago, particularly some of the routes that you see that are directly from Africa east across the Indian Ocean to Asia. Also, I'm sure you're all aware of the three big Gulf carriers, Qatar, Etihad, and Emirates. The amount of business traffic now between Africa and the Gulf and on to the east is very significant, and we believe in many cases these flights are being used to carry illegal wildlife products. For decades, AWF has recognized the harmful effect of the illegal wildlife trade on Africa's wildlife populations, and we've worked to combat it. Many of you recall our Only Elephant Should Wear Ivory campaign in the 1980s and 1990s. That campaign greatly decreased American demand for ivory products and eventually contributed to a worldwide ban on ivory. Now, thus far I've been talking about the illegal wildlife trade, which of course begs a question. Is there such a thing as a legal wildlife trade? The answer, of course, is yes. There is a huge legal wildlife trade that governs the sale of live animals and animal parts and represents over $300 billion in trade annually. This trade involves hundreds of millions of plants and animals representing tens of thousands of species. It includes the sale of live animals to zoos around the world, the trade of 2 to 3 million exotic birds, 10 million reptile skins, 500 million tropical fish, and the sale of African wildlife to exotic game ranches in places like Texas. And these are just examples. There is an international treaty that governs the legal trade in wildlife, and it's called CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. This treaty was adopted in 1973, and the purpose of the treaty was to ensure that the trade in wildlife did not threaten the survival of species in the wild. As a result of this treaty, approximately 5,000 animals and 29,000 types of plants are protected against overexploitation through international trade laws. Every 3 years, the 175 nations that are CITES signatories meet to consider new proposals to trade by the member states. The next CITES conference will be held in Bangkok, Thailand in March 2013. Now, the CITES process is dominated by two ideological positions. The first position that I'm going to talk about is the idea that trade is the answer to many of these conservation problems. There are advocates of the idea of free trade and sustainable use who say that the best way to conserve a species is to give it economic value. They also argue that CITES represents an open and above-ground system of trade that has safeguards and monitoring mechanisms in place. Advocates of this position would say making trade illegal does not make it go away. It pushes it underground where it cannot be monitored. Proponents of the trade is the answer position sometimes cite examples like prohibition in the USA and argue that it is impossible to stop trade wherever there are willing buyers and a willing seller. In recent decades, 3 countries in southern Africa that have large elephant populations, large stockpiles of ivory, and relatively good security, have lobbied for the right to trade ivory under carefully controlled conditions to known buyers. An experimental sale of 49 tons of ivory from these three countries was approved in 1997. At the time, AWF supported the proposal to allow this experiment to go forward. More recently, some groups in South Africa, and particularly private landowners who have rhinos, have advocated for legalized rhino horn trade as a strategy to reduce poaching. These landowners requested the government of South Africa to release some of their rhino horn stockpiles into the marketplace to try to meet the pent-up demand for rhino horn. It was believed that South Africa might bring this proposal to trade rhino horn to the CITES conference in Bangkok in March. All proposals to trade need to be submitted by early October to the CITES Secretariat, which is in Switzerland. AWF was watching this process very carefully, and in the end, South Africa did not submit a proposal to trade rhino horn. Perhaps more surprisingly, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa did not submit proposals to trade additional ivory from their stockpiles. Only one country has submitted an application to trade ivory in this year, and that is Tanzania, as you can see on this map. So I'd now like to talk a little bit about the sort of the second ideological position and sort of also AWF's view as we go into this CITES conference. Our view is that the trade as the answer position is too simple and is flawed at several levels. And I think we could describe the other position as trade exacerbates risk. The trade in these wildlife products exacerbates risk to an unacceptable level for species that are already highly endangered and sort of living on the edge. And I want to give you sort of four major reasons why we feel that the trade is not the right solution in this case. The first reason is this: the regulated trade does not necessarily replace illegal trade. And I like to use the analogy here of car sales. So, for example, there are plenty of new and used cars on the market. A bona fide buyer of a car has ample choices of product and ample choice of sellers. However, this does not stop criminal elements from stealing and hijacking cars and selling those to other buyers. Stolen cars can be sold more cheaply as the sellers invested very little in production or acquiring the product. So similarly, the criminals who steal ivory horn are looking for money, and they will still have an incentive to poach. The second reason we feel trade is not the answer in this case is that we think there is a fundamental mismatch between the potential scale of the market and the potential availability of legal supply. In China alone, 300 million people have entered the middle class in the last 20 years, and it's estimated that right now there are 150 million consumers in China who could afford to buy a gram of rhino horn at its current price. Meanwhile, there are only 24,000 rhinos in the world, and these rhinos reproduce very slowly and grow horn very slowly. AWF sees no prospect for a happy equilibrium where supply and demand could be balanced by market forces. Third, the controlled sales of ivory that were conducted in 1997, 2000, and beyond were intended to be experiments that would be studied and analyzed. It's difficult to prove direct causation, but there are now several very credible studies that have drawn a positive correlation between those sales and by increased killing of elephants, as measured by carcasses found in the field, and also increased seizures of illegal caches of ivory during the same period. At a minimum, it seems fair to conclude that the legal shipments of ivory have provided a cover and an incentive for criminals to try to launder illegal shipments of ivory. Our conclusion is that this experiment has not had a happy outcome. Finally, fourth and last, the argument for selling ivory and rhino horn is fundamentally one of economic realism, that wildlife should pay for itself and that the sales from ivory, for example, can be reinvested in protection work. In 2008, $15 million was raised by 4 separate sales of ivory, and that's, of course, substantial revenue. However, this looks only at the revenue side of the equation and ignores the costs of the trade. Trade in ivory requires very expensive monitoring and controls. Selling ivory requires a huge incremental investment in security, and it's donors and governments and organizations like ours who have been subsidizing the additional cost of having this controlled trade. I believe that if we looked at both sides of the balance sheet, the money being netted from ivory sales, but then the additional cost of all this additional security and loss, there would not be a compelling argument for trade. So what happens next? Well, first of all, from AWF's perspective, we're very pleased that the government of South Africa is following what's called the precautionary principle and not requesting to trade rhino horn at this time. Secondly, we are gratified that South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia have not requested an ivory quota to trade at this time. If we look only at national interests, it might seem quite logical for these three countries to want to sell their ivory stocks. However, AWF looks at elephants from a continental and an international perspective, and we have to consider the survival of the species as a whole. Our view is that it makes conservation sense for Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa to sort of take one for the team, and we're very grateful that they've agreed to do so, at least this time around. AWF has the greatest respect and affection for the country of Tanzania, which is really my second home, and one of the continent's greatest wildlife countries. Nevertheless, we believe that Tanzania's proposal to trade ivory at this time is ill-advised and poorly timed. We believe it has virtually no chance at all of being accepted at CITES and will likely be a diplomatic embarrassment. To further AWF's position on these issues, in March I will be attending CITES in Bangkok to represent AWF along with our Director of Conservation Science, Dr. Philip Maruthi, whom you see here with this rhino. So now, just to sort of wrap up, AWF recognizes multiple approaches are required to try and tackle this illegal wildlife trade. The solution is going to include many parties, from community leaders, park authorities, to consumers, government ministries, law enforcement, and even the military. AWF's conservation enterprise work, including conservation lodges and camps, helps to demonstrate that wildlife is worth more alive than dead. We've seen this, for example, with mountain gorillas. Today, a habituated mountain gorilla in Uganda roaming the forest is estimated to be worth $1 million to the Ugandan government. We see in areas where AWF is working and connecting with communities, such as in southern Uganda, where we helped build Cloud's Mountain Gorilla Lodge, which you see in this image, a high-end accommodation owned by the community, that where poaching does occur, the community will be a willing partner and help us to identify suspected poachers in their midst. There's also a need for education and public awareness in Asia, and for Asian workers resident in Africa to help curb demand. This image shows you our collaboration with WildAid aimed at Chinese consumers. Research has shown that many Asian consumers do not connect a wildlife product with a dead animal, believing instead that an elephant's tusk or a rhino's horn simply falls off and is collected by those who sell it. We need to dispel those beliefs and make buying wildlife products as taboo in Asia as it has become in the West. Another very interesting development is there is now a realization within the U.S. government about the scope and direct impacts of the illegal wildlife trade. In recent months, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, has become very vocal on this issue. The Undersecretary of State for Oceans and the Environment has become very vocal on this issue. I was recently in Beijing and met with the U.S. ambassador there, and embassies around the world dedicated December 4th as Wildlife Conservation Day in U.S. embassies worldwide to raise awareness on wildlife trafficking, wildlife conservation, and the issues related to this. So having the participation of State Department and security forces is we think, going to help us with this battle as well. AWF has been at the table for all these discussions, and we are going to continue to work to try and save Africa's wildlife from the illegal trade. From support on the ground, participating in international fora, public awareness campaigns aimed at Asia, all the things that we can do. We're committed to try and help stem this horrific assault on the world's most magnificent wildlife. Last but not least, I want to say that following the Rhino Summit that we hosted this spring, AWF has been raising support from people, including many of you on this call, and we are making specific targeted investments in improving protection on the ground in Africa. We've done that with rhino, and we are just beginning now to make specific targeted investments in protecting key elephant populations in the three major regions of Africa. I hope you've seen maybe in the past days the sort of wonderful gift and leadership that we've had from Betty White to help us raise funding, and this is funding that we'll use to make these grants in the future. So I think at this time I can take a couple of your questions. One of the questions is, what pressure is being placed on Asian countries which import illegal products? An excellent question. So as I've just mentioned, State Department is doing this sort of quietly behind doors. U.S. embassies are consulting with their peers and helping to point out, of course, that this trade is illegal, helping to point out once again that that it is not only a wildlife issue, that it is a security issue and should be viewed as crime. So we're looking for allies. Again, officials in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing told me about the appointments they were having with the State Forestry Commission, which oversees wildlife. And there is also state-to-state bilateral pressure being placed on. You may have seen a headline in the last couple days about a new agreement between South Africa and Vietnam. So additional pressure is being put on key Asian governments to enforce the law and to apprehend poachers and traffickers within their countries. Another question that's been asked is about what AWF is doing on great apes. This is a really good question, and one I'm happy to answer because it's an issue of much interest in AWF at the moment. As many of you know, we have a long and proud history working with mountain gorillas and also with the bonobos, or the pygmy chimpanzees as they're sometimes called, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As a result of that work, we believe we've developed some really good tools and approaches for working with Africa's great apes. And we're quite interested in taking those approaches and expanding them to other landscapes where the two other African great apes live, namely the lowland gorilla and the common chimpanzee. And so we are, in fact, in the process of planning and rolling out an African ape initiative that will look at African ape populations in other countries. The apes are, of course, in the forests of Central and West Africa, and we have identified a number of priority populations and priority landscapes that we're going to focus on for that work. Another question that we've been asked is about the use of drones to track wildlife. Yes, indeed, we are tracking this and are in discussions, and we're very aware of several experiments that are going on in Africa. One of the firms that we've been in contact with is a firm called GeoEyes. They have Falcon drones that are being experimented with in Kenya. We do feel that technology, the use of technology, is one part of the solution. You know, fielding teams of anti-poaching scouts is very expensive and very labor-intensive, where a drone can be put up and fly for hours and possibly catch incursions into a protected area, hopefully before a poacher acts. That can be very effective. So we do think drones is a possible partial solution to rhino and elephant poaching. Another question that has been asked is about how conservation groups are working together beyond the summit. That's another great question, and there are a couple of ways. First of all, we are meeting, for example, here in Washington, D.C. very regularly and basically updating each other on what various parties are doing so that we can be sure that our investments are complementary and not redundant. There are actually quite a few foreign mechanisms that allow the NGOs to get together and to plan and to, as I say, to sort of coordinate our investment. CITES as well will be a huge opportunity for the whole conservation community to come together to take stock of these species and to coordinate and plan our activities. In some cases, we are actually making co-funding grants with others to the same activity where it's simply too much for one organization to do alone. Another question, maybe the last question for today, is a wonderful question, how we can help. Well, I started the call by thanking you for your financial contributions, and let me say, of course, that your continued and increased support is very welcome and helps us to do more. Also, please try and help spread the word. Poaching is once again, unfortunately, a wildfire. It is out of control. It is back to the 1970s and 1980s level. So if you're using social media or on Facebook or with your friends, please try and spread the word. And if you have interaction with politicians, your members of parliament or members of Congress, any government leaders, please let them know that this is an issue that you care about as a taxpayer and a citizen, and that you want to see government officials pay attention to. And that, of course, encourages people to do more. So let me thank you again very much for making the time to join today for this update and for your interest. As you sign off, there's a survey box that will pop up, and if you have a moment, please do give us your feedback so that we continue to improve the way we do these seminars. And once again, I'd like to wish you all happy holidays, and thank you so much for your support. Thank you.